It's almost time for the holidays, and my client's getting ready to host all of her family at her house for Christmas this year. And she wanted to know, can she give her home a complete makeover so that instead of these dark, outdated, old 1960s, 70s cabinets, she can have a bright, modern-looking kitchen that all her family can gather around and enjoy. Stick around to the end of the video because you are not going to believe how good this kitchen looks when it's all done. So let's get started and get to work. The first thing I like to do on any kitchen cabinet project is prep the kitchen. I start by putting brown rosin all over the floors so that I'm not walking on the homeowner's floors, and you can see the brown rosin on the lower left corner of the screen there. Then I put a layer of brown rosin all over the countertops. That just adds a layer of protection and durability so that when I'm setting drills, doors, anything on the countertops, I don't have to worry about them. I still go ahead and put a piece of plastic over the countertops before I spray, but this is just an extra layer of protection that I like to do. I'm using frog tape because frog tape comes off really easy, even when it's been sitting on for a week. The adhesion is perfect. Next here, I'm removing all of the hardware on the kitchen cabinets. I make sure to throw all the hardware in the cupboard which it came from so that everything goes back on right where it was supposed to go. On this kitchen, when I was pulling off all the hardware, the clear coat had actually been brushed over it. So there was globs of clear coat gluing everything on, as you can see right here. The homeowner was actually going to be replacing all of the hinges and the handles, but she didn't get them in time for her Christmas party. So I ended up putting all the old ones back on in the end, as you'll see. But she's planning on changing them out, I believe, to a silver or something in the future. So that should look really nice and really give the kitchen an extra little boost. Here I'm labeling each door, and I cover it with a little piece of tape so that I know where to put them when I'm done. This is especially important on big kitchens. It will save you hours of time if you don't label them, because if you put the doors on the wrong area, you're going to end up with a bunch of doors and drawers in the wrong spots, and it's going to take an incredibly long time to get it all put back together. Here I'm sanding all of the doors, getting them ready for the grain filler. This just breaks down that original clear coat and gives me more surface area so that the grain filler can bond to those cabinets better, and it gets any leftover dirt, grease, grime, anything off the cabinet doors, and helps the primer bond better too when I get around to priming. So I just take my time, give each one a thorough sanding on the front and the back, really break down that finish. I also go around, as you can see, with a mud knife and break off any of those old little bumpers. These ones literally disintegrated as I knocked them off. They were so old and crusty. It was time for some new ones. So here we're just vacuuming up all the dust, making sure we have a clean work environment. We want all that dust gone. Nobody likes a dusty environment. And the cleaner we keep it now, the better finish we have later on. Next, I'm going into my homemade grain filler. I like to use about 3 parts of drywall mud to 1 part water. Sometimes I go a little bit heavier on the water, but I stir that up until I get a consistency kind of similar to paint. And then I literally go ahead and I paint the grain filler into the cabinet doors. You can see here, I just take a brush and I brush it all in. And then once I'm done with the door, I go back with a knife and push that filler in and scrape off any excess. And on these doors, they had little grooves in the middle, and she wanted to keep those. She thought they added charm. So I made sure to clean those out with my fingers. I do not put grain filler on the backs of doors unless a client specifically requests grain filler on the backs of doors. But grain filler is a really simple process. This grain filler is far more sandable than the ones you buy in the stores and far cheaper. So I highly recommend this process if you're painting oak cabinets. Gets rid of those deep grain pores that show as holes and contrasting color after you paint the cabinets. It just ups the finish quality significantly on old oak cabinet doors. For day 2, I'm going to start by sanding the grain filler. Then I'm going to move on to plasticking the kitchen and finish the day by spraying the first primer coat. Here I'm starting to sand all of the grain filler that I had previously put in the kitchen cabinets, on the kitchen cabinets the day before. There's a couple big points to remember when you're sanding off your grain filler. You want to use a fine grit sanding sponge, and you do not want to over sand your cabinet doors. You want to sand them smooth, But if you sand them too much, you'll start to sand the grain filler right out of the cabinet doors and thus make them have a more grainy appearance. So there's kind of a happy spot where you find that right amount of sanding. And when I'm done, obviously I'm going to vacuum it all up. You can see on the back, there's no grain filler, but I do grain filler on the sides and the fronts. I always ask my clients if they want me to do a grain filler on the back. It's a little extra work, so it's a little extra charge. Most people say, no, I really don't care about the backs of the doors. It's only been a couple times in all these 20 plus years that I've had people who want me to do a grain filler on the backs of their doors. Just taking my time, sanding them off, enjoying life. It's a very repetitive process, just one door after the other, sand them up. Kitchen cabinet painting altogether is a very repetitive process. There's only a handful of steps, but you repeat it over and over and over on every door. So it's an exercise in patience is what kitchen cabinet painting really is. If you have good patience and you can take your time, stick with something, you will be successful painting your kitchen cabinets. As we plastic everything off, I'm going to be using my 3M hand masker along with 1.5-inch frog tape. I use frog tape on everything in the kitchen just due to the fact it doesn't allow any bleed through and it releases really nice without pulling off anything or leaving any sticky film behind. So I'm gonna go ahead and start plasticking off the insides of the cabinets. I'm gonna move on to the countertops, the window, the appliances, and just create a plastic palace here to keep everything clean. So here you can see I'm running frog tape on the inside of the cabinet, and I press down the edge of the tape that's closest to me, and I leave the back edge of the tape up so that later I can come back and tuck the plastic into it. I start on one side, usually the top, and just kind of tuck it along and go around the whole thing until I get all the way back to where I started and just kind of reach back and tuck it all in. Just takes a little practice to get used to it, but it works really well. You can see there here, I just leave the shelves and all the hardware on the inside. That way everything goes right back where it came from. And then, like I said before, go around and tuck that plastic into the tape that I just put in there. If you have a cabinet that's kind of greasy, usually around the stove, you got to make sure to clean the inside. Otherwise, when you spray it, the tape will release and the plastic will fly off and you get a hot mess on the inside of your cabinet. So that's one thing to look out for when you're doing these projects. Some of them are, you don't really have anything to tape to. Like this one under the sink, there was nothing to tape to, so I just taped it to the backside, and then I'll go back with the brush and just kind of touch it up. But some cabinets get a little funky and you just have to be creative and find a way to tape them. Here I just did what I could and then took my little utility knife and cut off the excess plastic. On this job, we chose to use Bare Acrylic Alkyd. It's a nice middle-of-the-road enamel that's durable, looks good, and comes at a good price. I'm pouring into a 2-gallon bucket here because it's easier to mix up the paint in there. I do 20% water to thin it down so it sprays good. And I like to pour the water into the bucket so it kind of gets that extra paint because cheaper paints, good price paints, are expensive. Then pour that water paint little mix in here and stir that up until I get a nice viscosity that will spray good out of my sprayer. I almost always go with a 20% reduction. So if I have 128 ounces in a gallon, I'm doing 24, 25 ounces of water to thin it down. And you can see how nice that sprays. I'm using the Wagner Flexio 5000. It sprays really nice, a nice big fan, and it's atomized beautifully. If you pour straight from the can in here, you're not going to get good atomization. It's going to spray really thin because it's going to struggle to get that thick paint out of the sprayer. If you jump around on YouTube and you can see people using these with paint straight out of the can, it looks painfully slow. It's not atomized and it just looks like it's a struggle. On any sprayer, even expensive $1,000, $2,000 sprayers, you need to thin your paint out if you want that good atomization and get it to lay down really nice. I ran about 3 sheets of brown rosin over the countertop here, and I use that as my workspace. Just give it a lot of protection. Then I set up a little paint triangles and I bring over the doors one at a time. Spray the fronts. I like to spray horizontally rather than vertically. I could bring in a rack and hang them all up. That's what I used to do. But this allows me to really lay that paint on nice and I get a beautiful finish. And honestly, it is the best method for DIYers. If If you don't have experience spraying horizontally is so much easier. You're not going to get runs. That leaves your only option for run on the frames of the cabinet. So this is the only spot you'd have to look out for runs if you spray all the doors and drawers and stuff horizontally. So I'm just cruising right along here, spraying. You can see all that grain filler, and what a job that grain filler did. Let me tell you, these cabinets, you can still tell they're oak, but there's no holes in that grain finish anymore. You get a little waviness in oak, but it's smooth and it looked beautiful when it was done. Here, I'm just spraying more of those face frames, just going through the motion. I should have pulled my hood up because I had to go home that day and scrub paint out of my hair like a moron because I wasn't paying attention and didn't put the hood over my head. And a lot of that paint bounces back right into your hair, and it makes for a lovely shower when you get home. As I've said before on this channel, feel very lucky to be doing this. I love painting cabinets especially. It feels good at the end of the day to see your before and after. It's so drastic in how you transform a kitchen. It's very satisfying, and you know, it's a good living, pays well, it's good stuff. Here's all the doors starting to dry out. I just brought in a couple folding tables so I could have a spot to set them all to dry. And once the fronts are dry, I will flip them over and spray all the back sides.
Day 3 now, I'm going to sand down this primer. I'm going to caulk all the gaps and cracks in the cabinets and start applying the first coat of top coat.
The very first thing is to just come in and really give that primer a good sanding. You want to check it all over, make sure there's no rough spots, anything like that. Really, it's just give it a light sanding so that your top coat can have a nice smooth surface to lay down on. I use 3M extra fine sanding sponges for sanding my primer and my top coat. I use fine for sanding down my grain filler, and I use medium grit when I first go in and do the original sanding. So I go medium, then fine, then extra fine in between everything. And using fine instead of extra fine is fine too. Fine, fine, fine. Usually the sponges wear down pretty good and they work just fine. But if you have the option to go extra fine, I think it's kind of noticeable at the end of the day, but not really. Most people would probably be just fine using fine. So just get into everything, get all those little cracks, gaps, and everything. Now, before we can get started on the top coat, we need to caulk any gaps and cracks. Otherwise, they'll show up in the final results. And when I say show up in the final results, any gaps or cracks show up as a dark line on a white finish. So you really want to make sure to get rid of those. They don't show when it's wood grain, but afterwards, every little bit that isn't filled in is going to show as a contrasting gap. So you want to make sure to get that if you want a really professional looking result at the end of the day. For cabinets like this, the main thing you need to caulk is just where two pieces of wood butt up against each other, and usually some crown molding. Windows have tons of area to caulk, and this was a really big gap in these cabinets, so I actually had to caulk this a couple times. When I'm caulking, I like to use a wet rag and go over the caulking. It just pulls it really smooth and gives that caulk a really nice finish. If you use a dry finger or a dry rag, it tends to leave that caulk a little bit more rough, and you can see it through that final coat. With that out of the way, now we can get back to spraying the top coat. For the top coat, I'm using bare satin urethane alkyd enamel, and I really like using satin on just about all my projects. I usually recommend it to all homeowners. I do satin on all cabinets, doors, trim, windows, all woodwork. I love satin, and it's probably 95 to 98% of what I use. Again, I'm mixing it in a 2-gallon bucket. Gives me room to stir and add my 20% water. Put the water in the paint bucket to get all that extra paint out and get every last dollar of paint out of there. And again, I thinned it down by 20%. This is just the perfect viscosity for the Wagner Flexio 5000 and honestly all of their Flexio series. Shameless plug there. Please make sure to subscribe and like the video if you like it. Here I'm just spraying on that top coat. The top coat has a little bit of color, just kind of an off-white. You can see a little bit of difference here compared to the primer. It just gives it some great coverage, and they really start to get that finished look after this first coat. This is also where I became a believer in leaving those, I don't know what to call them, the lines through the cabinet doors. At first, I thought they were going to date it and look really kind of bad. But it's what the homeowner wanted to do, so I'm not going to argue that. When that top coat started to cover them up, I thought it started coming together, and I saw it. My wife said it kind of gave it a country charm. As that top coat went on, I saw it. The homeowner made the correct decision. So I'm glad she went with her gut on that because it was completely right. When you're spraying the frames, there's lots of overlap compared to the doors. The doors are big, flat areas. The frames aren't laying horizontally, they're vertical. So you have a much greater risk for runs. So if you're not used to spraying, this is where I highly recommend to dial the sprayer back a little bit and just go slow. There's nothing wrong with going slow. Cleaning up runs or fixing runs after is way more work than just going slow. I forgot to spray the underside of this cabinet, so I just hit it with an extra coat of top coat. Sometimes you see that happens, especially on undersides of cabinets. You just forget to hit something. And then I do have to turn around and go back in that little gap. You can see I couldn't see it at the moment, but I did get that little gap that you saw under the cabinet there. And today I remembered to pull my hood up after a nice long scrubbing paint out of my hair shower the night before. Nothing reminds you to do things right like fixing up your mistakes from the day before, whether it's the paint job or on yourself or whatever it may be. Day 4 was exactly the same. I came back the next day and I sprayed on the second coat of enamel. Doesn't really show up great in video, so let's skip ahead to day 5 and see how this kitchen turned out.
So the weather outside is frightful today, but this kitchen is about to be delightful. So make sure to stick around to the end and let's get cracking.
So there was a little mix up with the hinges on this project. The homeowner wanted new hinges. She was having a Christmas party the very next day after I was finishing, but she accidentally purchased the wrong hinges. So we made a compromise. We put all of the old hardware back on and I went back in with a brush and put on 2 coats of paint on all the hardware. Normally I would have sprayed the hinges on, maybe even left the doors on if she told me that the hinges were gonna get painted, because that's by far the easiest way to do it. I would have saved hours of time. But this was a last minute decision to make sure her kitchen looked good for her party the next day. As I put the doors back up, I peel off the little bit of tape that went under where the hinge goes. And there I've got my number 14 door. And I matched that up with number 14 in the cupboard. Put it back on. Everything fit in place, which is always lovely. Nothing worse than forgetting to label doors and then spending 3 times more time trying to put up your doors as you realize things don't fit, because you're putting doors and screws and hinges all in the wrong place. That's another one of those do it once and you will never do it again type mistakes. You learn from your mistakes on here, and that's how I learned. Everything I tell you I do right these days is because I've done it wrong before. I have done everything wrong at some point, and it is not fun having to go in and fix it. Here I'm just going in with the top coat and getting a little bit of paint on all those hinges. Like I said, this isn't how I'd recommend painting hinges, but it's how I painted hinges because I wasn't going to let this kitchen look anything less than the best it could look for that party. And it actually turned out really good. When it was all said and done, the hinges looked good, the cabinets looked good. You couldn't even tell that they were painted after the fact. The touch-up paint that I did around the hinges blended in flawlessly and looked perfect. She did at least get new handles. So the handles really made the kitchen come together and look fantastic, in my opinion. You didn't see this in the video, but it's worth mentioning that there is almost always a couple hours of touch-ups. I go around the kitchen, I find little areas that I missed, and that's just normal. Touch-up is a part of painting, and you got to be okay with it. We didn't show it in the video too, but we painted all her walls. When I spray cabinets, I go ahead and caulk the cabinets to the walls and overspray onto the walls. I do that on purpose to get really sharp, nice, clean lines. It takes maybe 2 hours, and it really takes a kitchen from, nice to fantastic. So after 5 days of hard work, I finished up the kitchen just in time. The client was absolutely amazed with the results, and I am sure you will be too. Well, that wraps up this cabinet painting job. If you watched the whole thing, make sure to leave a comment below. I love hearing when people watch the whole video. Thanks for watching. Until next time.